Just make sure that it's working before I start. Hopefully that is a thing that will happen, please. Okay, so we are broadcasting. That's excellent. Just making sure it's actually happening through YouTube, and it is. Good. Perfect. Okay. So, hello everyone. I'm just going to read out the introduction that I was provided with, and then we'll get into the panel. So, hello and welcome to the Social Distance Book Fest, where you can stay at home while supporting authors and indie bookstores, and hopefully add a few new books to your TBR. I know mine is already ridiculous, and it's only halfway through the day. I'm kathytrithardt, and I'm famous for my impossible-to-pronounce last name, my weekly wrap-ups, and as a co-creator of the Queer Lit Readathon. Today, I'm excited to be hosting an amazing group of authors for our panel, from Boys in Outer Space to Magical Girls and Guillotines, Queer Voices in SFF. So in a moment, I'm going to go to the panelists. They're going to introduce themselves, but if you're wondering what Social Distance Book Fest is, here's a brief overview. This is an all-day event created by a dedicated group of bookworms from all corners of the internet. We have 18 panels, more than 80 authors, virtual fandom meetups, virtual signings, and all of that information is actually linked in the description of this video, so feel free to click all those links once we're done here. And what I'm going to do is just let our panelists introduce themselves, including your pronouns. Mine are she, her. I missed that part. Take it away, whoever wants to go first.
All right. I'm Caruso. My friend is she, her. I'm the author of the Swords and Fire trilogy from Orbit Books, and I also have a new book that's starting a new trilogy, The Obsidian Tower, coming out in June.
Perfect.
That's it.
Cool.
Let's just go clockwise from there. So if Tara, you want to go next, we'll just keep going clockwise. Makes sense.
Me.
Yeah.
So I'm Tara Sim. I am the author of most recently Scavenge the Stars, right here, if I know where my webcam is. And also the Timekeeper trilogy. Yeah, that one.
Yes.
And pronouns are she, her.
Perfect.
Hi, I'm Asia Monet. I am the author of The Black Veins. My pronouns are she, her, or they, them. I'm cool with both. It's whatever you feel like doing.
Wonderful.
I am Laura Pohl. I'm Brazilian, and my pronouns are she, her, and I'm the author of both of these. Hero duology. Last name comes first, and first seven comes last. It's confusing.
I'm Maria Ingrande Mora, she, her. I am the author of Fragile Remedy, which was originally going to release in June this summer. It will now be released in March 2021 from Flex Books.
Wonderful. Great. Okay, that part is done. Let me get to my questions here. Scroll, scroll, scroll. So to go, starting with the questions I let you guys know about ahead of time. What draws you to write in this genre, and how does that intersect with queer identities? And again, we'll just try to go circular motion here. So if Maria, you would like to start, that would be great.
Sure. Writing in sci-fi has always appealed to me, I think, because stories, especially in film and TV, really growing up, I always felt like we found that the protagonists or their found families were sort of felt like outsiders. I think it really resonated with me, that notion that in order to survive, you had to find people who you connected with. And I think as a queer woman, I've always felt safer when I have a community around me that's really tight knit, and you sort of feel a little bit of you against the world. And that really kind of segued nicely for me into light sci-fi. Fragile Remedy is kind of borderline dystopian light sci-fi. I'm terrible at math, and science is fascinating to me because I don't understand it at all. So it's definitely not hard sci-fi. And I love reading that sort of light sci-fi too, where I feel like, oh, I just learned something that I wasn't paying attention to in physics class.
That's awesome.
Yeah. I think I've always the first stories I ever read were always fantasy and sci-fi. I grew up reading Harry Potter, so it's a natural person just to that was the genre I was always drawn to, and I think it's especially because it is a genre that's not limited by anything. And so that's what feels like very magical, very good about it. There's no limitation to what you can explore. And I think that intersects with your identity, especially because, you know, society says, you know, queer people kind of bad. Let's not do this. We have like a traditional sense of where we're supposed to be, and sci-fi and fantasy never limit yourself to it. So to me, that always feels very natural to have that intersection between not having limits and what you can explore to both like the world and yourself.
Great. Who's next? Am I next, or is?
We'll go with Melissa, so we'll just keep going in a circle.
Okay.
Sorry. It's fine. It's a weird format.
So I've always written in fantasy ever since I was a tiny kid. I mean, I think part of it is I think that you can tell in speculative fiction, you can tell any story you want, but cooler. A mystery story, but with magic, you know, or you can tell a family drama, but with ghosts, or, you know, you can tell anything you want and spaceships. It's just everything is better with fantasy. It's hard to say as to how my queer identity may have factored in. So I'm a spec, and I think part of it is that in speculative fiction, it's even if a romance is central, there's always lots of other stuff going on too for me to sink my teeth into. It's not, you know, sometimes in realistic fiction, it's like, okay, this really all that's going on is romance and relationship angst, and that was never in spec fic. Like, okay, there's relationship angst, but there's also like a bloody war with lots of explosions going on. So yeah, we're on board with that.
Yeah, as someone who's demi, that's always been like my thing too with fantasy. Like I always love romance, but never as the A plot. I always prefer it as the B plot.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so I, you know, like these other authors, I've always been reading and drawn to fantasy. You know, I grew up with Harry Potter, Tamara Pierce, that kind of stuff. I've just like always loved the freedom of it. So like obviously growing up and exploring, you know, queer identity and stuff like that, I always wanted to like transform that into the worlds that I'm building. So like, you know, there's like, you create your own rules. So like, and at the same time, it's like, no rules, just right. So like whatever you create is like your final thing. Like you are like almost like the voice of God. So like for Scavenge, for example, in that world, there's no racism, there's no homophobia. Like people are trans, people are non-binary, and it just doesn't matter. Like people don't care. Like you just be you. Just be you.
Yeah.
And because I'd much rather focus on the adventure and betrayal and stabbing.
Important parts, yes.
The important parts, yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everyone here. I feel like we all just sort of grew up with fantasy. So it was something that was a bright spot in our lives, even from when we were young. And for me, that definitely came through because I love characters. Characters are my favorite part of any story. And I feel like fantasy gives you another way to look at character, because instead of just questioning their relationships with other characters and such, like we talked about earlier, you get to question like, okay, well, you just found this magic sword in a stone. I get you're all powerful now, but how does that make you feel? Like, how do you know that you're a king? And I wanted to explore sort of the more emotional parts of fantasy. Like, yes, we are going on an adventure. Yes, we are battling monsters and we are in these giant robots, like getting the robots, fight with the robots. But like, how does that make you feel? And how does that make you relate to people around you? And how does it make you relate to yourself? And for me, getting into fantasy and being able to talk about characters in that way and talk about the ways in which the fantasy world affects the like versions of the characters that we can relate to, so their emotions and their relationships with each other, that has always been my favorite part. And I love that fantasy gives you this opportunity to look at character in kind of a different way that contemporary fiction doesn't really allow you to, because magic doesn't exist and all of these other things don't exist, but in this world it does, and you get to look at it in kind of an interesting, realistic way. And I've always been excited by that aspect of fantasy.
Fantastic. All right, my next question for y'all is, queerness is often erased or written out of history. How do you as an author work to counteract that action?
Ooh, I guess I'm first again, right?
Yeah, go for it.
It's intentional. it has never been intentional for me. I don't start a story and think I'm going to queer this story up. The nice thing about writing in fantasy and sci-fi is to Tara's point, you can create this world where you don't have to worry about homophobia. I'm a big Schitt's Creek fan, and something I love so much about that show and would talk about endlessly is that that's never there's this world where nobody is experiencing homophobia. And I realized kind of the trauma I was carrying when I got all the way through the story and continued to expect something bad to happen. And so it's always been really important to me in the spec fic that I'm writing that there's a lot of terrible things that are happening, life or death stakes, but none of them are somebody's identity being questioned or who they love being questioned or feeling that they can't love who they're loving. And that wasn't necessarily deliberate. And I realized, as I was going, that it was just creating that safety while also stabbing everyone. So it's like, yes, terrible things are going to happen. Absolutely. Really high stakes. You're going to cry, but you're not going to cry about somebody not being able to love who they love or be accepted by their friends or their family. And it's not to say that there's not a place for that in literature. There absolutely is, but it wasn't the stories that I wanted to tell. I wanted to explore these fantasy worlds, explore the adventures that I loved growing up that I did not see myself in.
Yeah. I think for me, like when I started seriously considering getting published, this was something that was like kind of conscious because I grew up like in a Catholic school and just I did not have a lot of queer friends. Like my queer identity like happened later in college, like a lot of people, and it was just this dawning realization of that was what's going on. Okay, and so when I started writing, I was 15, 16, so it wasn't really part of like how I wanted to tell my stories yet. And I was really also like afraid of publishing in general, not being overly accepting of stories that were essentially like queer. And also because, those things add up. Like you can write a queer story, but you cannot like write if you're a woman of color or if you are not cis, like these things weight on the publishing industry. They're always like, oh, you know what? We already have like one queer story. So you can you be queer and Latina? That's a lot. That's too much. So that was something that I was like started waiting when I started writing and wanting to get published. And then it was just really nice to see an encouraging community to tell me like be able to read books that featured other queer characters and see that this was something that was possible for me in the future. So that was kind of like when I started consciously inserting more things in my writing, but just because it was, somebody else's efforts, like other writers were doing this, so I could do this as well. Like I didn't have to be afraid. So I think that's what's nice to be like read a lot in our community and just see so many other queer writers coming out and discussing their queerness and just putting it out there in their work, because we encourage like the next generation of writers as well. So
yeah, I think I kind of wonder how common that is, but I know for me too, when I was first writing my debut back in I first started writing it in 2014, and in that one the main character is straight, and because I didn't feel like I had another option available, but the sort of co-main character is bi, and at the time at first I was like, I don't know how much can I do with this, but then I got nothing but support from my editors, I got nothing but support from my publisher and from my fans, and it just really, I felt much more empowered. And so like my books start a little bit queer, and then they get queerer and queerer as they go, like more and more characters. Like, okay, this person, and it's just and I've always had a like Tara was saying, I also write in worlds where your identity is just not even an issue. You're just a person. You happen to like who you like. Your gender is what it is, and it's just that's a part of who you are. But it's not. I didn't want to write about that struggle. Also, like Maria said, it's just not. I mean, and I think that people who do write about it, that's fantastic. And for that matter, science fiction and fantasy provide a lot of ways to do that in new and unique ways, because you have control over the entire world. You have control over concepts of things like gender and identity, and you can do things you never could in a realistic book. But for me, I I just want to write awesome stories where cool magical adventures are happening and people happen to be queer. And for me, that's all I want, and it's fantastic.
Yeah, same with you guys. I, grew up writing books that were pretty hetero, and then it just gets gayer and gayer and gayer as it goes on. To answer, like, kind of quite literally, my first series, the Timekeeper series, is historical fantasy. So in regards to, like, not erasing queerness from history, I very, like, adamantly put queerness into history. And it takes place in, like, the 1870s and, like, mostly, like, London and India. So, like, that stuff wasn't smiled upon back then. But, going back to the previous point of, like, I wanted to create a world where it is okay. So I kind of, like, rewrote history a little bit in that regard, because it's important to me for teens to, like, read stuff and be safe, have a safe space. And, I agree with Melissa that the stories that do kind of, like, focus on, like, homophobia and, like, coming out and that kind of stuff, they are important. But for me personally, I want to focus on stuff that's more stabbing and betrayal and less, like my main character, Danny, in Timekeeper. He has so many secrets that he has to keep, and like stuff that he has to figure out, but I didn't want his sexuality to be one of those.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Like, in terms of creating a safe space for queer readers is definitely important. And like we all said, like, there is definitely a place in literature for stories that want to handle those heavier topics and those really, really real and a little bit darker topics. But there's also space for really lighthearted stories where, like Tara said, people just get stabbed, and that's
lighthearted.
For me personally, when it comes to making sure queerness isn't erased from history, I think it's actually a sort of twofold issue, in that I sort of have, or personally, this sort of responsibility to be able to show up authentically as both myself as a living queer woman, and to allow my characters to show up authentically. But in terms of history, there's definitely been times where people have shown up authentically. They have tried to tell those stories, and they've been shut down by, like, gatekeepers, like what Lara was talking about. And there are just not enough opportunities for those stories to be told. So I think in that way, it's kind of a twofold situation, in that, yes, we can tell queer stories. We can tell them to the best of our ability. We can show up in spaces, and we can be proud about who we are, and we can do everything we can do. But at the same time, there needs to be an equal acceptance from gatekeepers and people who have power in that way, to allow us those spaces and not erase us from history. Because I really doubt that queer people in history were like, yeah, erasure, cool, I'm fine with it. No one got to talk to me, I'm fine. Like, it's a big issue, and it's sort of twofold in that way, that, like, we tell these stories and we show up, but also that we are allowed different spaces to tell these stories. And the internet also helps with that. There are a ton of indie creators out there who are doing, their own work and telling their own stories. And that's why we definitely need to support those creators that are sort of doing their own thing and doing their best. So yeah, it's a big thing. A lot of details there. I said a lot of stuff, but that's
what we're here for. That's fine. So my next question has to do with the work that you're currently promoting. So what specifically made you want to write this story, whichever one you're talking about today?
I've been asked this question a lot about Fragile Remedy, and it's tough to answer, because I think, I spoke briefly to this, kind of not putting maybe necessarily a lot of thought into it beforehand. I tend to get kind of grabbed by an idea and I want to run with it. And the idea for Fragile Remedy, literally, I was just driving in a car listening to a song. And I don't know, when I grew up in the 80s, we would sit in the back seat and kind of make up music videos to songs on the radio, because we didn't have anything else to do in the back seat. And so I've kind of retained that habit. So when I'm driving, listening to music, I'm getting pictures in my head, and this picture wouldn't go away, of sort of this gang of tech scavengers. So I just started going. And then as the story evolved, and I'm a pantser, I'm really trying to become a plotter. I'm really trying to grow up. As the story evolved, I didn't expect it to deal so much with drug abuse and addiction. And that was clearly me working through some stuff. And again, not intentional. And I think that for some authors, when we're working through some stuff, we don't sit down and to write for the day or to even outline a book and say, I'm gonna go to a place that maybe I didn't want to access or didn't know I was going to access. So that there's some alchemy that happens there, I feel like, when you're writing. And I think that allowing the queerness of this book to kind of flourish and be without angst associated with it gave me the space to explore other really dark themes within this fantasy world, and that's kind of where it landed. So I don't know if that answers the question, but it was sort of a rolling process where, you know, things were happening and I was letting them happen.
Yeah, I think when I start writing my book or when I get an idea, it's usually like a response to something I've seen. It's and not like, you know, like a bad response, you know, I hate this book, so now I have to write a better one. Though it has happened, but I think the idea is that like I want to interact with the same media that kind of like formed me and helped me get through life. So when I started writing The Last 8, it was kind of like my response to Independence Day, which is a movie that I love and that I grew up watching like every time, even though it's hilarious because I'm not even American. So like it has no emotional attachment to me, but I love Will Smith and I love, like, I was gonna say Jeff Goldblum. It's like, oh my God, accusations of, you know. So I kind of like why I wanted to write a story that felt similar in tone to it, and that had like this big adventure and with a big cast and like, you know, people fighting aliens, because I've always wanted to write something with aliens. And now my next book, which is coming out in 2021, it's called Doomed, and it is about like 4 fairy tale princesses who are also queer. So that's kind of like also what I wanted to explore. I've always wanted to do fairy tale retellings, and now I get to write like my favorite stories as well, but you know, my way. So
that's great. For me, so usually when I start a book, it comes there's some kind of image that I have or some idea for a scene or a character interaction. It starts very nebulous and then builds out from there. And for this book, I was actually in the middle of editing another one, wasn't even thinking about what I was going to write next. And my agent said, we need to pitch your next book. And I was like, I don't know. So, but, and I gave her all these different ideas and all of them had the same, I'm being bitten by my cat.
That's what cats are for.
Had the one thing that they all wound up having in common was this castle. This is really awkward, but I had this idea for this like kind of rambling castle that had all these weird secret places in it, and that was built at all different times in all different ways. Like part of it is made out of bones, and part of it is made out of trees, and then there's the stone castle, and there's like the modern manor, and they're all kind of like intertwined and eating each other. And that there was this, that it was this kind of like spooky, creepy, evil wizard kind of castle thematically. Except there was this girl who'd grown up there, and to her, this is just home. This is cool. She likes it. You know, all its little, this cool room made out of bones. I grew up here. This has got a lot of nostalgia in it for me, you know, and that she was living this weird, isolated life because she had a magical power where she can't really get close to people. I don't know, this sort of image of this girl rattling around in all these weird secret spaces in this creepy castle and just having it be totally normal for her just really clicked for me. And that was sort of the basis for the book.
I also want a bone room. I feel like this would be very comforting for me. So Scavenge the Stars, for folks who don't know about it, is the first of a young adult duology. It's a fantasy reimagining of like the Count of Monte Cristo. So basically, like at the core of it, I really wanted a story about a girl getting revenge, and like I've said a million times before, stabbing people. Specifically stabbing the men who've wronged her and her family. So yeah, I mostly, like when I go into writing a story, a lot of times it'll come to me in different ways. So like when I started, when I got the idea for Timekeeper, it was an image in my head of a boy in a clock room. For Scavenge, it was more of like a feeling, or like an aesthetic, I guess you could say, like one of those like Pinterest boards of like, you know, the sea and ships and like this coastal city state, kind of like Monaco, and there's like gambling and like seedy stuff going on, and like glitter over grit, and I really wanted to like encapsulate all of that feeling into a book. So I tried my best. So hopefully it came across. And the sequel comes out early next year too.
Nice.
Love that. So for me, the Black Veins came about when I sort of asked myself two questions. I wanted to know where all of the platonic queer relationships were in fantasy, and also where all of the queer people of color were. And personally, I love magic, I love road trips, and I love monsters. So I was like, I'm just going to take all three of those things. We're going to put them into a blender and see what comes out. And the Black Veins is what came out. And I was like, okay, this is fine. But yeah, I really wanted to explore the power of friendship, which is one of my absolute favorite tropes. I know we were talking earlier about how romance can often take in a plot, but I was more interested in seeing what happens when you don't put it in your story at all. And what I ended up with was a story in which 7 really diverse, really different teenagers come together under one goal. And basically what ends up happening is you just see all of these kids who are completely different, who have these different personalities, who come from different walks of life, coming together under one common goal. And a lot of humor happens, a lot of nonsense happens, there's a lot of shenanigans, but of course I love that, so I was totally fine with it. But most importantly, you end up seeing these kids grow to love each other. You grow to see them care about each other and consider each other as friends. And of course, there's fun things going on. They're being chased through time-traveling forests by giant monsters. They're stealing cars. They're doing all of this absolute reckless nonsense. But at the end of the day, they also have very heartfelt moments, in that the main character, Blith, her family is kidnapped as part of a magician war. And she is enlisting all of these guardians to help her find them. And there are a lot of quiet moments as well in which they kind of sit with this truth of the fact that her parents are gone and she is missing them. And she is the 16-year-old girl out in the world on her own, and she's trying to get her family back. And the only people she has to help her are these kids who she barely knows. And so while we are on these wacky adventures and doing all these things and driving these cars through these time-traveling forests and fighting these monsters, we also get these cool moments in which we see these characters just relate to each other and grow to love each other. And not in a romantic way, but in a platonic way, because platonic relationships and friendships, like, obviously are just as important in our lives as the romantic ones. And I really wanted to give an entire book to see like what would happen if we just allowed these people to form these relationships and we gave them the space and the energy that platonic relationships deserved. And basically, I'm literally just doing a long version of explaining the found family trope, but
I'm here for it. I said I'm here for it.
Found family trope, my favorite trope. I'm gonna write about it until I die, probably. But it was really fun just to say, okay, like, let's see what these kids are going to do if I put them on this adventure and give them the space to, you know, do all these things. And it was just really important that I really just gave this stage to these queer teens of color, because when I was looking for books like this personally, when I was growing up and a teenager, I didn't really find much of any. And I definitely wanted to put a story out there like that for readers. So
that's wonderful. Yeah, I have all of your books on my TBR, like especially on Goodreads, because that's where I try to track everything. But I was definitely just mostly excited when I realized that some of your books were already on my TBR when I went to go to make sure that I put them on before this panel. And I was like, oh yes, I have heard of these books. Oh my goodness, I get to talk to these humans. So I just had to fangirl at you because I'm sure the chat would appreciate me doing that. So my next question before we move into some audience questions is, do you have any queer icons who influence your work, or any books or authors that you would like to shout out at this time?
The first, the Litsy was the first queer book that I ever read, and I also grew up Catholic. Kind of went to college and had some space to kind of, I don't know, get away from being at home. And I took a queer theory class kind of right away in college, so I kind of had somebody curating and handing me things. And reading Litsy was really incredible. I read it all in one bath. I kept emptying the tub and filling it up again with hot water, and just had this whole kind of awakening, I guess. So definitely Francesca Leah Block and Litsy. And then Ellen Kushner's Swords Point I bring up a lot because it was really the first spec fic that I read with an unapologetic queer universe, and a lot of depth. It is a romance. It has romance, but the romance is sort of a B plot, and there's a lot of other things going on, and it just really inspired me in terms of how weird a story could be too. Not just the queerness of it, but just Ellen Kushner clearly just said, you know, I don't care. I'm going to do what I want. And that energy, I was like, I want to take that energy with me for the rest of my life, through my career and everything I do. I want to write. You can tell she wrote what she loved. And that's really has to be inspiring, I think, for authors. If you're not enjoying what you're putting down on paper, you're not going to be able to sit with it for years and work on it as hard as we have to work. And I found that energy to be really inspiring to me, because I was like, I'm gonna write what makes me feel good, what makes me cry, what keeps me up at night. All of these things, just dig in really hard to the emotional side and write what I connect with.
Yeah, I think I was like trying to figure out who I would say, and I think the first person that comes to mind when I think about like icons that I want to like get on their level, it's Noelle Stevenson she wrote my Mona, and I love just the energy of, you know, stabbing rivals, and like it's very queer but also not the focus. And now we have like Shira on Netflix, and
So good.
Shira's just, you know, it's amazing. It's what I would have loved to watch as a kid, and now I get to, you know, I'm 26, but I still like love to watch Shira, and it's so fun and so magical, and it has like this family energy to it, to all their friends and people who care about each other, while also being extremely like because the thing about it is, when we talk about queer identity, I think that a lot of people ask about romance, and they only consider a book as gay if they have like a romantic relationship, which is not true, because we grow up, like when you grow up, it's very hard to have romance as your focus, especially if you're queer, like to try to identify yourself, but not exactly, like romance doesn't always come first, because that's something that can be hard for you to like, I don't know, connect with someone romantically when you're growing up. When you're a teen, you don't know like how people in school will react or how it's all going to work. So your relationship romantic isn't always the focus, but your friends are, like the people who are with you. And I think Shira kind of like does that energy. They have that energy. Like first comes like the family you found and your friends, which are the people who support you, and that's great. And I will shout out like 2 books that are coming like later this year. I don't think they've both been postponed yet, but they are by also like queer Brazilian authors. One is Here the Whole Time, which is by Fitra Martins. Both are coming out by Scholastic, and the other one is Where We Go From Here by Lucas Rocha, and it comes out like in June. They're great books, and they're both very queer and very Brazilian at heart. So it makes it's really lovely to see them coming out, like being translated and coming out into the US to the hands of readers. That's be really cool.
That's awesome. Let's see. So I'm going to mostly be shouting out current ones, because what I'm honestly so excited by how much more speculative fiction with queer main characters we have right now, especially not only for me, but for my daughters, who are both queer teens. And like, it's just being able to have them grow up in such a different world than we grew up in, where there's this abundance of characters who are like them, is just never stops giving me warm fuzzies. But anyway, some of the ones that I'm really looking forward to, the Jasmine Throne by Tasha Suri is an Indian-inspired fantasy trilogy coming out soon that I'm extremely excited for. I loved Empire of Sand, and I'm so excited that she's writing like a super queer series coming up. And I also am a big fan of KB Wagers. They've got one of those worlds where queerness is completely accepted and normal, and just there's nothing to be said about it. It's sci-fi, which I'm normally more of a fantasy reader, but it's like very character-driven sci-fi, so you don't have to be into the hard stuff to get into it. And they've got not only do they have their Pale Bristol books, there's 2 whole trilogies, but they've got a new book coming out that I haven't read. Well, it's out now that I haven't read yet, The Pale Light and the Black, which is like my impression is everybody's great. They've got ace characters. They've got all kinds of different characters. So I'm really excited to read that one too. And it's like a space Coast Guard kind of found family book, and it sounds amazing. I've just currently I'm in the middle of reading The Unspoken Name by A.K. Larkwood, and it's got this real Tombs of Aton kind of vibe to it that I'm really loving, so I'm eager to see where that one goes.
I blurbed that book. It was very good. Badass orc priestesses falling in love with questionable people. It's amazing. It's so good.
I'm loving the beginning, and I'm super excited to see where the rest of it goes. So,
yeah. So for anyone who knows me at all, they probably know how much I love Victoria Schwab and how much I look up to her. I'm actually friends with Victoria, but like as I still like look up to her as like an idol, like not in like the weird like celebrity idol kind of thing, but of like more of like I really love what you're doing, and like the transparency that she has, like the embracing her queerness not only like with her readers and with her work, but just like in life in general. I just like really appreciate what she's doing. And I hope to kind of like get on that level someday. More recent books that have really made an impact on me are Gideon the Ninth and Red, White, and Royal Blue. I feel like both of these, so I'm not a big rom-com person. Like that's just not my thing. But like what Casey McQuiston did in their book is so amazing. Like it's so unbelievably funny and heartfelt that it just kind of like, it was one of those books that I literally had to just like sit in bed for 2 straight days and like not move and not do anything except read this book. And I was actually like traveling while I was reading it. So like my friends in the other room would just hear me like cackling as I read the book. And Gideon the Ninth was super, I don't want to say formative because it was a recent book, but like still kind of like in that vein book for me, because it kind of like takes this really wacky, weird goth energy that I strive for all the time in my writing, and just like mixes in this big dose of like queerness and just like amazing characterization and world building, and the humor in it is absolutely amazing. So those books are like the most recent of my like upper echelon of like everyone should be reading these books basically.
So for me, one of my biggest queer influences, I feel like everybody knows this, it's Janelle Monáe. She is so bold, so unapologetic, so creative, just so many things. And it also feels like I was destined to love her because my mom is a super huge Prince fan, and Janelle Monáe is super influenced by Prince. So of course, I have to be a super big Janelle Monáe fan. It's just at this point part of the family line. And I just really admire how, like I said, unapologetic she is, how bold she is, how easily she knows herself, and how eager she is to appear fully in a space. And also her music just slaps. Like it's just good. Just 10 out of 10. Like it's amazing. In terms of recommendations that I have for you guys, this is How You Lose the Time War. It's a really great book.
So good.
And the whole panel goes, yes. Yes. So good. It was so fun. The prose is beautiful. The story is absolutely beautiful. And I listened to it, I was listening to it on audiobook, and I don't think that it was extremely long. So if you like audiobooks, you can listen to it and you can get through it relatively quickly. So I imagine you can also get through it quickly by reading. Also, it's like time war. It's very stabby. I know it's a stabby panel. And so
Yeah.
And yeah, I just think everybody should read it. Like Tara said, like this is one of my books I think everybody should read. It's so good. And another one for you guys, if you guys enjoy comics and webcomics, my friend has a webcomic called Animal Heads that she pitches as quite literally be gay, do crime. And now a ensemble cast of 4 friends who end up forming their own little crime syndicate, and things go wrong. And they have to figure out what they're going to do and how they're going to solve this issue that has appeared. And you get just a lot of really good platonic relationships. You get a lot of good romantic relationships. And you can find it on Tapas. and I think on Webtoons, if I'm not mistaken. But most importantly, you can also find it on Kickstarter. They are trying to print volume 1. So if you can, I would just highly suggest you go out there and support them, because art is amazing, art is amazing, characters amazing, creators are check it out.
Fantastic. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to move into some audience questions. And the one that I just popped off my page that I wanted to ask first was, how detailed are the character profiles that you write?
Like during the drafting process?
Yeah.
Mine start out really, really shallow. Like I screw up height immediately. I forget how tall people are. I forget their hair color or length or cut. So I have to write down some of those, because like I'm revising a manuscript right now. And another thing I do is I realize every chapter is in a different season. I'm like, it was so hot. And then it's like, I grabbed my coat and put a scarf on and I'm reading it. I'm like, so I do some really light basics. And then on kind of the first big revision round, I started doing things like taking personality tests on behalf of the characters and sort of thinking about what kind of playlists they would make on Spotify and things like that. And that slowly fleshes them out. But I don't actually write a very detailed character sheet on the first draft.
I don't think I ever like do super detailed character sheet ever. It's just I don't know, it's just kind of like a natural process for me. I just start making up, oh, this character is gonna be like, you know, kind of, you know, like Animal Crossing profiles, you know, this is grumpy and this is lazy. And just that's kind of like vaguely what I do. But usually the first thing that when I start drafting characters and thinking about my story, the first things I want to do is the relationship between that one character and all the other characters in the book. So I want to know like how they react to their family, if they love their family, if they kind of like, if they have brothers and sisters, what's the relationship like? And one of the first things, this is kind of like hilarious again, because I don't know how many of you, I hope all of you have watched Pacific Rim, because it is an amazing movie. But the first thing I do is like, who is this person drift compatible to? This is like, that is the most defining relationship between them both. It was like, what does this person mean to this other character, and like, what would they do for them? And that's how I always start with my characters. And then I just scribble down like eye color, and just so I don't get lost in the drafting process, because or else it will definitely be like, you know, her short hair and now she has really long braided hair and now she has no hair at all. Like I just forget things in the middle of the sentence. So that's kind of what I do. And I always start with relationships rather than like individual personalities. I never do quizzes or anything of the kind. It's just, it really bores me, and I can never get out on the characters like inside, you know, to answer it. I'm just like, this question's, no, I'm just gonna do it like the more natural way.
Yeah, I do. I also will focus when I'm in the early drafting stages, when I'm taking notes on a character. I'm not really paying attention to their appearance and stuff. It's more, I'm looking at their relationships. I do the same kind of thing where, okay, if they're going to be working closely with these characters, what's their dynamic with this character? And I'll just have like a little thing about their dynamics, and also a little note about their overall arc. Like what is, if there's some kind of conflict that they have going on, whether it's with another character or internal or whatever. And I usually will have just a little bit on their backstory. Like there'll be some little, here's their tragic backstory element, you know, that influences how they look at the world. Or it doesn't have to be tragic, but you know, it is a lot of the time. But that just sort of gives them a lens. And you may not even find that out ever, or not for a few books, but usually I know what it is, because then it helps me add layers to how they're interacting with other characters. Like, oh yeah, he wouldn't like this guy because he's going to remind him of his dad, who he hates. And you may never know that he hates his dad, but you know he doesn't like this certain type of person who doesn't do well with authority figures. And, you know, and it just gives me sort of a way to flavor their relationships with other characters.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I kind of do the more natural method as well. I don't really do character sheets. I used to when I was younger, because I just wanted a place to like have like eye color, hair color, all that kind of stuff. But now it's just like stuck in my head. Like once I get an image of them, it's like stuck. It's like cemented. Because I'm very visual when I write. I always like play things out like cinematically in my head before I write it. So for me, when I write through a first draft, it's me like figuring out who the main characters are, and like mostly focusing on their emotions, their flaws, and their actions, and like how that influences how they change and like how they make decisions, basically. So like once I kind of like finish a first draft and know the basics of these characters, I'll go back and do what I call like my 1.5 draft, which is like, okay, now I know who you are. So I'm going to go through and just kind of like revise to make sure that you are consistent throughout the whole thing. And for like side characters, these side characters are kind of tricky because I always want to like focus on the main character first, right? So for my side characters, if I don't really know who they are yet, I'll just make them like an archetype. Like I think Laura was saying something about like Animal Crossing villagers. It's kind of like the same thing where I'm like, you're going to be grumpy and you're going to be sunshine and you know, that kind of thing. Or like, you're going to be like the charming thief and stuff like that. And then like, again, when I go through revisions, I'll like work on how they relate to the plot and how they relate to other characters and kind of like fill them out more from there.
Cool. I'm glad to hear that a lot of us actually do like the whole natural method, because like when the question was character sheets, I was like, oh my God, who doesn't actually make character sheets? But I'm glad to hear that, you know, this is common. Like character is my favorite part, which is why it's kind of funny that I don't make character sheets. I kind of go by this strange method of just, if I make something up for the character in my head and I forget what that fact was, it's just not accurate to that character. The way my brain works is that if I make up something and it fits like a shoe on this character, like a glove, I'm like, all right, cool. I'm never going to forget it. I'm just going to remember that this character has this trait or this character comes from this home. But if I make something up for them, like, for instance, I'm like, oh, they're from a really sunny hometown. And like a day later, I've completely forgotten. And I'm like, actually, they're from a cold climate. Then honestly, maybe the sunny one wasn't really that accurate. And so mine is kind of a bit closer to sort of an improv, in that the important parts are the parts that usually end up sticking. In terms of consistency and keeping things together, it's 9 times out of 10, it's just like, I just like what Tara said, I have like an image of them in my head. I sort of can see their eye color, I can see their hair color, I can see what they look like. And so it's a bit easier for me to keep that in line, because I'm less likely to be like, oh, I forgot he was blonde, because I'm literally like looking at him in my head and he was indeed blonde. But yeah, so for me, like making characters is really one of my favorite parts. And like everyone was saying, like I really like seeing how they fit in terms of relationships. I think Melissa was talking about this specifically, like seeing, okay, how do they relate to this character and how do they relate to that character, and using those relationships to inform more about the specific character that I'm thinking about. So if I notice that they are very annoyed by like a very happy character, I might say like, okay, then maybe there's something going on there, that like they don't like optimism, or like they don't like sort of specific traits like that. And it's almost like a therapist and they're sitting down on my couch and I'm like, so I noticed that made you upset. Like, why? Why do you feel that way? It's like I'm having this interview with my character. And it's a really, for me, organic way of getting to know my characters. And it works a little bit better for me than like putting things down on a sheet. I like to just sort of throw them all like in a pit together and be like, now fight, go. Let's see what happens.
That's fantastic.
I love that method, the go in and fight.
Because you're
whatever comes out alive. Yeah.
I don't know if anyone's seen Gravity Falls, but there's like this one episode where Crinkle Stat keeps going, fight, fight, fight at like everything. And I'm like, that's me and my characters.
Not enough stabbing. Okay. Our next audience question is, do you ever picture your audience as you're writing or editing, and what does your ideal reader look like if you do?
I don't. Outside of the fact that I'm really cognizant that my readers are teens, and there's a level of caution that I take that I wouldn't necessarily feel all the time if I was writing for an adult audience. I feel very, very protective of teen readers. And that's not to say that I'm going to sugarcoat anything. My books are pretty dark. There was a time where I was reading through them and thinking, thinking to myself, is this too much? Is this too grown up? I'd hate to say that, you know, and I quickly realized, no, I want to be as straightforward with my readers as I would have wanted anyone to be with me at that age. But at the same time, when it comes to potentially harmful rep, that's always on the back of my mind. I don't want to say it probably is more so than if I was writing for adults, because it's that kind of maternal instinct comes over in me. And I'm like, I don't want anybody to ever read anything I've written and come away from it feeling hurt or not seen or anything. You know, I want them to cry because of the things I wrote in the book that's really sad, you know, that hopefully we'll all just have a nice cathartic cry about. But I don't want anyone to put it down and feel hurt. So because it's a teen audience, there's that. But I don't think there's an archetype or a specific way that a teen would look or feel that is the ideal audience. There is somebody, many somebodies who will pick this book up and just really enjoy it in terms of if it was a escapism. And I don't know who that is. I know that it was me when I was 14 or 15. But I don't know, you know, I did a school visit yesterday with 8th graders and on Zoom, and I could see like the couple of kids, I was like, you're my people, you know, like you're going to read this maybe, or read something like it and have a similar response. But again, I couldn't even begin to guess, you know, who those kids are. I just hope that they have that moment of escapism, because that's what books have always been to me. That's why I started writing, is because I started piggybacking off the stories that meant a lot to me and telling kind of transformative works to myself before I ever knew what anything like fan fiction was or anything like that. I was literally like, peace out, family. I'm going to bed at 6 p.m. And they'd be like, what are you doing? And I'm like, nothing. Don't come in my room, you know, and I'd be in my bed like sword fighting, you know, but trying to cram characters into stories that I could relate to. So it's kind of that person, that nebulous person who just wants to get lost in a book.
I think I agree with that feeling. I will say that I'm very selfish with my writing when it comes to like first drafts and everything. I mostly want to write for myself and like the stories I wanted to have first. So that's kind of like, it's always a me perspective, and it's just like, what would I like to explore and what would I like to see first? So that's one thing. And I think it's kind of like what keeps me going, because if I was worried all the time about someone who was going to read it and whether or not they like it, that would get things complicated. Because a lot of people will read a lot of books and they will like some stuff and they won't like some others. And if you ask a second person, they will like the stuff the other person hated, and they will hate the stuff. Like, it's very subjective. So you can't, even with people who like the same book, like, you know, we all love Red, White, and Royal Blue. And if you ask the question like around us, and you're going to ask, what was your favorite thing of the book? And each one of us will say something different. And it's kind of like that. Like, there's no ideal reader, because readers are people, and people are so subjective, and their opinions are just so varied. So you can't really choose and like pick and choose what your ideal audience looks like. The ideal audience will be someone who will read the book and like it, and that's all I can hope for as a writer.
Yeah, the way I look at audience actually changed really dramatically for me at this one point. It was before I got published, and I had been writing books really very much for myself, as just sort of something I was doing in my head to entertain myself. But I'm also a gamer, and I run tabletop games, and I LARP, and I run LARPs, and I realized at some point that I was like, I think I'm a better GM than I am a writer. Why is that? And for me, what clicked was, when I GM, I'm always thinking about not just what the story is doing for me, but how my audience is receiving the story, how they're interacting with it. I'm thinking, oh, this is going to break their hearts, or they're going to be really surprised here. And when I realized I could bring that into the story, and that I wasn't just like writing this self-indulgently for myself, then I was able to write a story with that awareness of the people reading it. But it's never like a specific audience, like everybody else has said. It's just whoever wants to read my book, if you like it, I'm thrilled. You can be anyone. If you read my books and you like it, I'm very happy. So I think of them as sort of this, just like you would imagine an audience in a theater. When you get up there, you can see that there's people out there. You can feel their reactions and the energy in the room, but you can't see their faces usually. You can just hear the gasps or just sense the energy, but you can't see the faces. And that's kind of how I think of my audience, I suppose.
Yeah, similar to what Laura said, I kind of do that thing where I'm like, I want to write books that I would read. Like, what would I love to see here? What kind of like plot twists would like make me gasp out loud and stuff like that? What would make me laugh? But I do think about audience in like two different ways, and one of them is kind of like the self-confidence side, where I'm like, well, they like this. And like you try to like shut that voice out, but like I can't completely, like, so I'm always being like very critical of what I write. And similar to what Maria said, writing for teens is a very specific thing because I don't want to hurt them in any way, but I also don't want to sugarcoat. So I write a lot of dark stuff. I write a lot about like grief, and what I hope for is, like, I don't have a specific reader like in mind when I write. I just hope that my books, my writing will get to the people who need them the most. I've definitely had people come up to me, sometimes in tears, which is startling to me, being like, I really needed the story at this specific time and stuff like that. And it really makes me happy to hear it. But these people are so varied. Like, one time I was even like out walking my dog, and my neighbor, who is a middle-aged man, was like, "Hey, I read your book. It was pretty good." And I was like, cool. I can never show my face here again, but cool. Yeah, so like, honestly, there's no like one specific reader that like I think about, but I do hope that it does find the people who I'm writing for, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Audience is really, really big for me. I think about that a lot, primarily because as a reader, when I was growing up, I often felt like I, as an audience member, was not being considered. There's this sort of double bind that happens when you're a queer person of color, in that when you read books that contain people that share your ethnic identity, they do not share your queerness. And when you read books that contain your queer identity, they do not contain your ethnic identity. And so you always feel a little bit left out in almost every bit of media you consume. You're always wondering, okay, I see that everyone else around me is getting great representation, but like, where am I? And what I think about when I'm writing is all of the queer readers of color that would want to be reading my work, because I feel like we were saying, like, representation, of course, is important. And it's something I value very highly. I think about a lot. So when I'm writing, I always want to make sure, like we were saying, that like I don't hurt my readers, especially my teen readers of color. The last thing I want them to feel is betrayed by a space that they thought would be safe. And this really helps to inform all of the writing that I do and all the ideas that I have, in that if I want to go somewhere in a story, if I want to approach a certain plot line or bring in a certain character, I ask myself, okay, is this something that these readers would want to or need to read? These readers who are often so ignored by most of mainstream media, are they going to feel like this was one of like the only places that they could see themselves, and I just ripped something nice away from them? And so audience is actually really, really important for me. It helps me to define what I'm going to write, and how I guess I'm going to write it. Because like we were saying, I write for myself first. I'm not going to write something if I don't think it's cool or if I don't think I'm going to have fun doing it. But the second thing that I ask myself in terms of the way that I go about writing it, or the certain details that I put in, is how is this going to make my audience feel? Like we were saying, like, I want you to cry over a sad plot point. I want you to cry because like I just ripped your heart out with a plot point because I knew it would break your heart. But I don't want you to cry because you feel like you weren't seen or that you were ignored. So my ideal audience for me would just be queer readers of color, because they are the people that I think most about when I'm imagining who I'm writing for.
Perfect. And that's a perfect way to end this, because that was so poignant, and like the whole chat is just blowing up with yes, this, and I love that so much. We only have about 30 seconds left, so if anybody wants to say any final words, now is your chance. Jump in if you have anything.
Just thanks for inviting and for this great talk. I think.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. If you ever want to do something like this again, I would love to host another panel like this on my channel just whenever, because obviously I have the time right now.
Yeah,
so
I just want to
if
keep
you're
chatting with
interested.
you guys. I'm like, let's just do this every night. This is awesome.
Perfect. Okay, well, I'm going to end the chat now. We can still chat once that's done, but thank you for everybody who showed up. Thanks for all your comments scrolling by. Everybody just needs Tara's next book to be called Stabbing the Stabbening, so put that in the back burner, and yeah, go check out other panels because there are so many right now. All right, stopping the broadcast now.